This podcast is created in partnership with Montclair. It's 6 in the evening, on the 31st of July, 1954. Two men embrace at 8,611 meters on the peak of K2. They look around. Are they really on the summit of the second highest mountain of the world? Before their eyes, an unending vastness of peaks and glaciers, and as many as 3 8,000ers. The broad peak and the two Gasherbrooms. The Goldwyn Austen Glacier, the upper part of Baltoro, and many minor peaks. They've risen above them all. Time is apparently at a standstill in this immensity. 3,600 meters below, they catch a glimpse of the base camp on the moraine of the Goldwyn Austen Glacier. And further, beyond the eastern edge of the summit, they spot the two small tents of Camp 8 at an altitude of 7,630 meters, where their companions are waiting for them. In the final stretch of the climb, the north wind has swept away the clouds and cleared the sky, but the cold has become unbearable. Achille Compagnoni and Lino Lacedelli are the two mountaineers of the Italian national expedition, and now they'll have to contend with temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees. They're bundled in down suits, their feet clutched by warm leather boots. As soon as they reach the summit, they remove the oxygen tanks and leather mittens to film one another with their camera and take pictures. But their hands soon freeze up like stones, and they can't feel their own fingers anymore. Just moments before, they tied to an ice axe the flags of Italy, Pakistan, and the banner of Club Alpino Italiano, the Italian Alpine Club. These two climbers are the first to have reached the summit of K2. Up there, 8,600 meters high in the thin air, each movement, every thought, costs enormous effort. These two men might not even be fully aware of it, but they're making history. This endeavor will never be forgotten. As Lacedelli will say, many years later, at that time, climbing K2 was like going to the moon. 70 years ago, two Italians conquered K2, the second highest summit in the world. In this podcast, we tell their story to understand how important it was for an entire country. I'm John Vincent, and this is K2, Like Going to the Moon, a Cora Media podcast. This story takes place in the 1950s, a decade of expeditions to the highest summits of the planet. K2, the second highest on Earth, is the fourth 8,000er ever reached in the history of mountain climbing. In 1950, the French climbed Annapurna. On the 29th of May, 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the peak of Mount Everest. And just a month later, the Tyrolese Hermann Buhl will set off, astonishingly, on his own, to challenge the summit of Nanga Parbat. For Italy, K2 will be just as important, if not more so. But in the mind of the two Italians on the peak, there's no place for complicated thoughts. In that moment, none of the members of the expedition, nor the companions down at the camps along the Abruzzi Ridge, realize what an astounding event this is. Nor can they even imagine what will happen once they return to Italy. Conquering the second highest peak on Earth was a pivotal moment in the history of Himalayism. The fact that in just about 15 years, one after the other, all the great mountains over 8,000 meters tall would be tackled and climbed has several explanations. A different approach to high-altitude climbing, and, most importantly, a great improvement in materials. Before the Second World War, the giants of our planet were being faced with the same clothing used for the Alps, such as knee-length pants and tweed jackets. After the war, down suits completely changed the game. George Finch, in 1922, was the first to realize that sleeping bags, which had been in use from the beginning of the previous century, could be modified to be worn. And he came to this conclusion during one of the many British attempts at climbing Mount Everest. At the beginning, he met some resistance, but soon enough, cotton jackets and pants filled with the finest down feathers became commonplace. Save for the most violent and prolonged blizzards, cold was no longer such an obstacle. Moncler was one of the first companies that equipped the Italian expedition. Founded just 2 years earlier in Monestier de Clermont, the brand was immediately integrated in the field of mountaineering. Up until this point, Moncler hadn't been producing jackets, but made sleeping bags using down feather technology that provided warmth while being extremely lightweight and portable. In 1954, this same insulating technology was applied to mountain clothing, keeping climbers warm and making it easier to move on expeditions. It may be hard to believe today, but just like islands, mountains needed to be discovered as well. There was such a time when even the tallest peaks were still unknown. K2 was located and measured from a distance on September 10, 1856, with a theodolite, a precision optical instrument used by topographers. In this case, it was pointed at the mountain range of Karakorum, which at the time was still a mystery in the West. We'd have to wait until 1887 for someone to set their sights on the mysterious northern slope of the mountains. This person was Lieutenant Francis Edward Younghusband, while part of the British espionage network during the so-called Great Game, a battle of military intelligence for control of Central Asia. He found himself venturing for 20 months from Beijing to Srinagar in India. When Younghusband set his eyes on the northern wall of K2, a perfect cone, he would find himself at a loss for words. Soon, from 1892, mountaineers started to show up at the foot of the mountain. The first to come were the English. Then, Robert Lercot from Gressoney with a few porters. Shortly after, we can find reports of the first true attempts at climbing K2. 5 attempts in all, from 1902 to 1953, in epic pages which today have almost been completely forgotten. Then, in 1909, the exemplary expedition of the Duke of the Abruzzi, which counted on the best guides available from the Aosta Valley, and which attempted the climb from the eastern ridge, which to this day is called the Abruzzi Ridge, in his honor. The attempts to climb K2 become more and more frequent. The Americans throw their hats into the game as well. In 1938, medical doctor and mountaineer Charles Houston makes his way as high as 7,900 meters, past some of the key points of the climb. The difficult rocky path at 6,650 meters, which was first climbed masterfully by 25-year-old Bill House, and the challenging Black Pyramid. After installing 9 camps, and without using any oxygen tanks, mountaineer Wiesner and Sherpa Pasangdavalama reached the incredible height of 8,380 meters, climbing the leftmost section of the narrow and steep ravine known as the bottleneck, which today is part of the regular climb. They would then find themselves forced to come down at night. However, after a series of misunderstandings and mistakes, the exploit would end in the death of mountaineer Dudley Wolf and of the Sherpas Pasankikuli, Pasankitar, and Pinso, all of whom would be buried under an avalanche. These will be the first of many. K2 is infamous not only for being one of the most challenging 8,000ers, but also one of the most dangerous, especially on the way down. At the start of the 1950s, Himalayan mountaineering is taking the place of exploration adventuring, which had captured the imagination ever since the 1700s. After all, there's very little left on Earth to explore. On the other hand, high in the sky, there's a whole universe of new, unexplored, and faraway territories. A place of epic challenges, great exploits, and tremendous tragedies, as well as the uselessness of the endeavor itself, which is typical of mountaineering. Annapurna, Everest, and K2 are on the front pages of newspapers and on magazine covers. In the entire world, there are only 14 mountains above 8,000 meters in height. And although the idea of climbing them all will have to wait until the 70s in Reinhold Messner, the word 8,000er enters the language of journalism and is on the lips of people all over. The members of the expedition know all the stories by heart, as well as the tragedies that we just mentioned. But on the peak, Compagnoni and Lacedelli have other things on their minds. Right now, the only thing that the rope team descending to Camp 8 can allow itself to think about is surviving and making it back intact to the final outpost where their companions are waiting. Here, they'll be able to finally eat, drink, and rest for a few hours before taking the road down to the lower camps of the Abruzzi Ridge. But at such a high altitude, time is so very slow. Especially in the so-called death zone, above 7,200 to 7,300 meters, where the mountain changes entirely, as if part of another planet. Those that have been there say that it's almost as if you're living and breathing in a separate atmosphere, where everything is much slower. And it truly brings you to appreciate the air that we breathe down here every single day. Let's go back to July 31st, 1954, just minutes after reaching the peak. Night is approaching fast. The sun is still shining on the mountain summit itself, but down in the valleys and the icy corridors, it's already dark. They need to get down, and right away. Their gloves are frozen stiff, and in order to put them back on again, they need to be cut at the wrist. Compagnoni loses one, ripped away by the wind. Lacedelli gives him one of his. Thoughts and gestures are slower and slower. They would like to rest up there, to stop thinking at all, but that would be the death of them. Lacedelli pushes his partner to hurry up. They turn their backs on the summit and face the way down, the most perilous moment of all. One step, another step. All they have for light is their flashlights and the stars. They don't even have any fixed ropes. Suddenly, Compagnoni slips on ice and he falls on his side. It could be the end, but it's only a moment. He's saved by the rope that Lacedelli managed to attach to the ice axe. They survived this one, but there's no time to dwell on it. They must go on towards safety. Don't miss an episode of this series. Click on follow, and most importantly, hit the bell and rate 5 stars on Spotify. K2, Like Going to the Moon, is a Cora Media podcast, created in partnership with Moncler. It is written by Leonardo Bizzaro, Roberto Mantovani, Vinicio Stefanello, Luca Calzolari. The voice is by John Vincent. Editorial care is by Marco Villa, with the support of Sarah Poma. Translation is by John Vincent. Sound and music supervision is by Luca Micheli. Post-production and editing is by Cosma Castellucci. Sound engineer is Luca Possi. The project manager is Silvia Arcidiacono Mutti. The producer is Alex Peverengo. Post-production coordination is by Matteo Scelsa. Editorial support, Valeria Luzzi.